and arguably more important than looking at total food supply in a district. But that changes, as I'll come to in a minute, if you look globally. The key point that Sen emphasizes in his seminal work, Poverty and Famines, is that normally functioning markets, and indeed normally functioning political systems, can allow famines to happen. You don't need market failure or market collapse, or indeed political failure. This system itself can be set up in such a way that if you take it to its logical extent, you take it to extremes, famines will occur without the system failing. Of course, sometimes systems do fail, but they don't need to. So if all normal market processes can allow famines to happen, therefore there needs to be a responsibility to address periodic famines, whether it is of the government or whether it is wider than that. And of course, sometimes famines are not accidents at all. Sometimes famines are deliberately engendered by groups which can, in sometimes, include governments. So we need to ask, what is the specific intended function of a particular market or particular political system from the point of view of the key stakeholders? So, for example, there may be an advantage for a government in allowing an ethnic minority in a particular district of that country to starve because it makes them less likely to be able to have an insurgency. So, if we want to define famine in a way that embraces the fact that famine is a long-term process with long-term causes as well as short-term triggers, and which embraces sociological and economic and political aspects of causation, you end up with something like this. This is one of my favorites. I'm not going to read it out. You can read it for yourself. But this is complicated. And although this would be close to my own definition of famine, what it is not is an instrumental definition, because you can't use that statement and then say, so now we know when there is a famine starting to occur and when there is not. It still remains context specific. Where do you draw the line between chronic hunger and an acute crisis? How do you observe and measure the point at which there is an acceleration of the destitution of the vulnerable? So, as I said, what I want to do is look at different academic approaches to famine, different conceptions of what the problem of famine is, and therefore what that tells us about what the ways to approach the problem is. I'm thinking both about acute famines and global food security. So, from the point of view of environmental science and climate, the role is to try and predict crop failure, so to predict rainfall failure. And it's not impossible to do. It's easier than you might expect. Predicting things like the El Nino effect, using techniques to do with the sun, to do with tides, and so on. And certainly you can predict when there is a drought. You can predict that will mean there'll be a food shortage, normally several months later. Plant science, again, the problem is about food crop failure, so attempts to improve yields, to recreate a green revolution, if you like. I mean, India was always produced less food than it required until the 1960s, had done for hundreds of years. Since the 1960s, it has been consistently a surplus producer. So by that logic, if we could have a green revolution for Africa, it would solve part of the problem. And not just in terms of total yields. I mean, if you could find seeds which were drought resistant or salt resistant, that would obviously help cultivation in difficult circumstances. Economics, more concerned with the distribution aspects, trying to anticipate periodic crises. So it is a given in certain parts of the world that there will be a food shortage every now and then. It might be every decade on average, but of course that averages don't help that much. It might be that you have 3 crop failures in a row and then you don't have another one for 30 years. But if you know that they're coming or they're likely to happen, you can have questions like, should we have a weather insurance system? Should we have a futures market on the prices of commodities, including food, so that even in a case of shortage, the food price doesn't go up so far that people can't afford it and entitlements fail? Should you have strategic grain reserves, physical stocks in certain parts of the world? An expensive thing to do, but logically an effective way of being able to respond to a food crisis before people start starving. Politics thinks then still about the distribution questions, but also about the consumption questions, about what are the incentives. Sen, okay, an economist, but writing political economy, says in fact that famines are incredibly easy to prevent. We might not agree with that, but his argument is that what you need is an incentive, and that is all you need. So he argues if you have a really functioning democracy, if you have a functioning free press, like in India, you will not have famines. And empirically, it's quite difficult to disprove that. There has never been a famine in a functioning democracy. My problem with that is that there isn't a functioning democracy in most famine-prone parts of the world. According to Sen's definition of a functioning democracy, it does not exist in sub-Saharan Africa apart from in South Africa. So it's actually a slightly tautological argument. But nonetheless, in terms of what you can do about it, that's useful. And then from an ethical or legal point of view, there is a human right to food. It's there in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It's under the social and economic rights. How do you enforce it? Does a democratic approach, for example, make that right to food material? Does it make it effective? Does constitutional law help? There have been cases in India, in South Africa, where class action type cases have been brought against state governments by or on behalf of starving people, usually much later, but which incentivizes future response. Can you guarantee at least sufficiently socially just distribution systems to prevent starvation death, whether at a local level or indeed globally? Should there be an enforcement, sorry, I went backwards. There should be an enforcement of the human right to food at the global level. Should the international community take responsibility for intervening before people starve? So what about hunger as a global problem, and trying to throw up some difficult ethical questions in relation to these solutions? So hunger is normal because global food markets are set up to be unequal. So there are a lot of literature recently has looked at the global market for food and the way in which it operates, and the way in which food is exported from countries where there are hungry people, and or where incentives to produce food in the countries which most need it are misplaced. Also, markets are increasingly volatile, and of course we saw this in 2007, 2008. Perhaps because of the Australian drought, perhaps because of biofuels, perhaps because of speculation. I mean, there's no agreement about what caused that very rapid increase in the price of all cereals in global markets, where the price trebled or quadrupled for some cereal crops for about a year and then went back down again. You had this spike. One thing there is agreement on is that this spike was not going to be the last one. In fact, there is already a mini spike happening right now in 2010 because of drought in Russia. Should the international community take responsibility? The difficulty here is that under the United Nations system, you cannot intervene in a sovereign country unless you are invited. And that applies to responding to hunger as much as it applies to responding to a civil conflict. The UN can't intervene in civil wars in the way they can intervene in wars between nations. So the World Food Programme, the relevant United Nations body, has to wait until the government declares a famine before it can intervene. And as I said earlier, governments are disincentivized to declare famine early because it makes them look bad that there's been a famine on their watch. Should that change? Would we ethically like to have a situation where the global community, the international community, tries to identify famines and goes in anyway. So they change that rubric. The danger with that would be it could make it unnecessary to have local responsibility, what I talked about earlier. If you have global responsibility, then the government of a country doesn't need to worry about the cost of anticipation or prevention. And of course, local responsibility could be undermined. There's an important concept of food sovereignty, which is the idea that you shouldn't, it's the exact opposite, you should leave it to a national government to decide how it wants to respond to anticipate food crises. Do local governments sometimes know better than international institutions how to run their countries and solve their problems? Well, yes, we know that, although sometimes governments don't necessarily prioritize the needs of the poorest and most remote rural populations. So is food self-sufficiency the answer? So a national level answer. And again, I mean, if you're talking about a country like Malawi, Niger, countries which have had famines in the last few years, where the majority of the population, 85% of the population, are farmers, where there isn't much apart from agriculture in terms of the economy, and yet which haven't traditionally produced enough food for their populations. Well, yes, if they could concentrate on that, that would be a good idea. But we have to be careful, because since the 2007-8 spike, other countries are asking this question too. The UK government is asking this question. Should the UK move towards food self-sufficiency as a strategy instead of importing 38% of its food? This would have a very different consequence. If the UK or Greece decides that it wants to be food self-sufficient, that means importing less, including importing less from countries where agriculture is the only sector of the economy, and therefore you're actually arguably cutting off an opportunity for economic growth from poor countries. Malawi is the most interesting case because in 2005, the Malawi government decided that it was going to heavily subsidize fertilizer and for all households and biased indeed towards small farmers. And as a consequence, having been food insecure, Malawi having produced less than it required for 13 out of 17 years, since 2005 it has always produced a surplus. Again, it might not in 2010. So, good policy, right? Except that it's extremely expensive policy. It is taking a very large chunk of the Malawian budget. Is it sustainable in the long term? And secondly, it's chemical fertilizer. We've already passed peak phosphorus. So it's not sustainable in that sense. And also, we know that chemical fertilizer in the long term degrades soil and reduces soil fertility. So it isn't necessarily sustainable in that sense either. But what about the option of not investing in agriculture, as indeed most developing countries did not do, most African countries in particular, did not do for most of the late 20th century? Is it economically sustainable, bearing in mind that in some countries we know that there will be famines and that famines are very expensive to deal with? And is it ethically sustainable not to have food security as a national priority? Do governments necessarily anticipate crises as a priority given that expense? Does, for example, democracy make them more likely to, given that in many countries the poor are the majority and therefore they can vote in an instrumental way for famine prevention? Should aid focus on improving these accountability mechanisms, these political systems? Should British or Greek or European Union aid to countries have conditions about democratization, about listening to the voices of rural, grassroots civil society? Or would that be